Welcome to Reading the Gospels Together for Wednesday, May the 13th, and we're reading the Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, verses 1 through 8. Now, I'm sure you've discovered in your own Bibles that if there are verses after verse 8, they're either bracketed or they're footnoted or they're italicized. That's because the very best early manuscripts we have of Mark's Gospel all end at verse 8. Let's talk about this for a moment. The New Testament you have in your hand is a part of a long line of translation and preservation, all the way back to the original authors taking pen in hand and writing the words down in the original Greek. Now, happily, we have no shortage of New Testament manuscripts. There are about 5,300 or so Greek manuscripts of the New Testament of various sizes and dates, from the early 100s all the way through to the 400s AD, comprising altogether about 2.5 million pages. Now, some are just fragments of a few verses, others are complete. Some have writing on the back and writing on the front, which helps us figure out exactly where on the page that piece of manuscript would have come from. Such a vast trove of manuscripts allows us to reconstruct the original text of the New Testament with a very high degree of confidence. New manuscript discoveries, when they arise, tend to confirm or at most fine-tune our Greek New Testament editions. Now, the earliest part of the Gospel of Mark found is a fragment from a book style or a codex copy rather than from a scroll style copy. And it dates from the earliest from about the middle of the 100s, a century or so after Mark was actually written. Now, why so late? First of all, we don't have any original copies right from the hand of a gospel writer. None of those have survived. Now, that's not surprising when you consider that papyrus, the early form of paper used by the writers, was pretty fragile stuff and didn't age well outside of dry desert conditions. Also, when copies became too worn to be useful, they would simply be recopied and replaced, and the worn copy discarded. The books of the Bible still existed in separate pamphlet form, not all bound together, like the complete New Testaments we have today. That was a later technology. You can imagine how, from being passed from hand to hand and sometimes hidden from the authorities in a time when Christianity and the possession of Christian books was illegal, and Christian literature often confiscated and burned, you can imagine how old copies didn't often manage to survive. In one ancient monastery, a scholar in the 1800s discovered that pages of one of the oldest Bibles ever made were being used to wrap butter. Now, as a result, the earliest complete Gospels of Mark, which we have today, date from the early 300s. That's chapters 1 through 16. Now, they're included in what we would recognize as complete Bibles, containing all the books with which we are familiar. Those big, huge Bibles are called Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus. Now, both have the Gospel of Mark ending at verse 8. Strong evidence at this point that is recognized as proper and was regarded as proper by the great majority of the Christian community throughout the empire, for whom these very rare and very expensive Bibles were being produced for the very first time. In addition to ancient manuscripts, we also gain knowledge from early scholars and teachers as they wrote about the Gospel of Mark. Clement of Alexandria and Origen, writing in the early 200s, show no knowledge of the existence of the verses beyond verse 8. And furthermore, Eusebius and Jerome in the 300s attest that the longer passage was absent from almost all Greek copies of Mark known to them. So some guys in the 300s had collected together as many copies of the Gospel of Mark as possible. They've gone through them. They've said, most of these end at verse 8. The best ones all end at verse 8. So today we're going to take their word for it and stop our reading at verse 8. And tomorrow we'll look at these other endings. Now, if Mark really does end his Gospel there are two primary alternatives. First of all, that there was a longer ending written that was somehow lost. Secondly, that Mark intended to end it this way. Now, we'll consider the first alternative tomorrow, the lost ending. But today, let's think about what it would be like to have Mark actually end with verse 8. Now, chapter 16 begins by providing a fair amount of detail. We read, "When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance to the tomb?" Now, that doesn't sound like the build-up to a short ending. We're told who was there, why they were there, when they were there, where they were going, and the problem they faced. Who would roll away the stone? A couple of things to notice. We're told that they bought spices when the Sabbath was over. That would have been after sunset on Saturday, to anoint the body of Jesus. They're not wondering whether or not he's still alive. They're completing the burial process, which had to be hastily abandoned by Joseph a few days before. We're told they leave on Sunday as soon as sufficient light permits, and we're told that they're already worrying about moving the stone. Now, they'd been in hiding with the other disciples. There's no concept here that any of their number had snuck back to the tomb and stolen the body. Next, we're told, but when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. Well, I'd be alarmed too. Notice Mark describes what we presume to be an angel simply as a young man dressed in a white robe. Notice also that he's sitting on the right side, which is where the body of Jesus would have been laid, but it's gone. Don't be alarmed, he said. You're looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter, he's going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. Now, the big line here is, tell his disciples and Peter. Why and Peter? Was it because Peter had denied having anything to do with Jesus and so was no longer thought to be a disciple? Was this a way to include Peter again? Was Peter not staying with the others out of shame and needed to be sought out independently? I love thinking about such things. What do you think? And now the big ending after 16 chapters of build-up. Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Now, we know what happened next. We have the testimony of the other Gospels, filling in the blanks. But other people only had the Gospel of Mark. If it really ended there, why end in this way? And what would people believe as a result? One possible answer is that the testimony of the resurrection had to be delivered not in print, which was considered far less reliable in those days than verbal testimony, but firsthand from an eyewitness. Early evidence tells us that Peter was still alive at the time of Mark's writing. Would he then speak of what he saw? Does Mark, as it were, hand the microphone over to Peter at this point because only eyewitness testimony would do? The Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 lists those to whom Jesus appeared after the resurrection, including 500 others, and including eventually Paul himself, assuring the Corinthians that they had their own eyewitness confirmation of the resurrection in Paul. But Paul tells us that as many as 500 were still alive at the time of his writing. Did they spread, these eyewitnesses, these 500 eyewitnesses, did they spread throughout the empire, providing verbal testimony about the resurrection, following Jesus' orders to go and make disciples of all nations, and you shall be my witnesses? See, we often imagine someone sitting and reading the gospel alone. Imagine instead a group of Roman Christians and seekers secretly gathered in the catacombs. The Gospel of Mark is read in its entirety, ending with verse 8, with the women running away. And then Peter stands up and in his own voice finishes the story. Or Mark does, or any of the many other eyewitnesses. Paul, this is very important, Paul in Romans chapter 16, a letter he writes to the church in Rome, introducing himself to them. He has this section of greetings at the back of the letter. And in Romans 16, he describes a couple, Andronicus and his wife Junia, as apostles before me, which is to say, eyewitnesses of the risen Lord now resident in Rome. Did Andronicus and Junia have the job of finishing the story? Now, not everyone is satisfied with this picture of Mark ending so abruptly. Tomorrow, we'll discover a few of the solutions which the church came up with. Most Bibles nowadays will include at least one. Read those longer endings and let me know if it sounds like Mark to you. We'll see you tomorrow.